There was a time when Stewart Granger looked like the answer to every dream Hollywood knew how to sell. He was tall, dark, commanding, a man made for swords, deserts, horses, duels, and dangerous women. On screen, he seemed born without fear. He crossed jungles, he fought villains. He wore velvet-like armor and carried a pistol like a birthright. He stood in the center of technicolor worlds where every shadow was dramatic, every romance impossible, and every man was measured by courage. To audiences, he was not merely an actor, he was escape. He was the figure who appeared when ordinary life felt too small. But the cruelest part of Stewart Granger's story is that the qualities that made him unforgettable on screen did not protect him in life. His confidence became impatience. His passion became pressure. His appetite for movement made stillness almost impossible. And the man who could conquer a battlefield in a movie never quite learned how to remain safely inside a home. He won fame. He won money. He won admiration. He married one of the most beautiful actresses in Britain. He was courted by Hollywood. He became the kind of leading man studios built empires around. And then slowly the world changed. The studios stopped needing him. The roles became smaller, the marriages ended, the applause thinned. And the heroic figure who once seemed too large for ordinary life found himself facing the one enemy no swashbuckler can defeat: time. This is not the story of a simple downfall. It is the story of a man who mistook motion for freedom, a man who spent his life chasing the next horizon, only to discover that a horizon is not a home. This is the hidden tragedy of Stewart Granger, the screen hero who could survive almost anything, except the quiet. To understand why audiences believed in Stewart Granger so completely, you have to imagine the kind of man the post-war world wanted to see. Britain had endured years of rationing, bombing, separation, grief, and waiting. People had stood in queues. They had watched cities darken. They had learned how to live with loss as a daily weather. And when they went to the cinema, they did not always want reality. They wanted splendor. They wanted danger that could be defeated. They wanted men who looked as though the world could wound them, but never break them. Stewart Granger arrived at exactly the right moment. He had the profile of an old painting and the physical assurance of a cavalry officer. His face carried arrogance, charm, and vulnerability in strange proportions. He could look severe one moment, amused the next, and dangerous without raising his voice. He was not soft glamour. He was not the delicate kind of actor who seemed built for drawing rooms and whispered confession. He moved like a man who preferred the outdoors. Even in period costume, even under studio lights, there was something restless in him, something impatient with walls. The public loved that. Women saw romance, men saw command, producers saw money. And Stewart Granger saw a doorway. Behind that doorway was a bigger life. The strange thing about screen heroes is that audiences often confuse their gifts with their souls. If a man looks brave, people assume he is steady. If he looks romantic, people assume he understands love. If he looks noble in costume, people assume nobility follows him home. But Stewart Granger was more complicated than the roles that made him famous. He was charismatic, but not always gentle. Frank, but not always kind. Brave, but not always patient. He could be warm, funny, generous, and magnetic. He could also be proud, difficult, and volcanic in ways that made peaceful life hard to sustain. The public saw the broad shoulders. The people closest to him saw the sharp edges. And those edges had been formed long before Hollywood knew his name. He was born James Lablache Stewart in London, into a world that carried traces of discipline, culture, and expectation. His father had a military background. His family name carried echoes of performance and music through his connection to the celebrated opera singer Luigi Lablache. There was a kind of inherited theatricality around the name, even before young James Stewart stepped on a stage. But he was not born into the extreme wealth of aristocracy. He was born into something more subtle: respectability, the kind of background that teaches a boy how to stand properly, speak correctly, and understand that life is watched. He was educated at Epsom College and later trained for the stage, but what he seemed to possess most strongly was not merely training. It was presence. Some performers learn technique. Others arrive with an energy that makes people turn their heads before they know why. Granger had that. As a young actor, he entered a profession built on uncertainty. Theatre demanded discipline. Film demanded luck. Both demanded a tolerance for rejection, insecurity, and reinvention. And reinvention came early. There was already a James Stewart. Not just any James Stewart, but the American actor who would become one of the most beloved figures in cinema. So the young English actor needed another name. He became Stewart Granger. A new name can be a costume. It can also be a prophecy. Stewart Granger sounded smoother, stronger, more cinematic. It sounded like a man who belonged near candlelight, danger, and forbidden romance. And in choosing that name, he stepped into a version of himself that the world would eventually adore. But performance is a dangerous bargain. The more convincing the mask becomes, the harder it can be to remove. In the 1930s, Granger began moving through the world of British theatre and film. It was not a world of instant reward. It required patience, discipline, and a willingness to be overlooked before being noticed. The stage taught him control. Film taught him stillness. And both taught him that the audience did not merely listen to what a performer said. They watched how he entered a room. They watched where he placed his hands. They watched whether he believed in his own authority. Granger believed. That belief was part of his power. It was also part of his danger. Because a man who believes too deeply in his own force can begin to treat compromise as weakness. In the early years, he was still becoming himself. He was not yet the international star. He was a handsome young actor in a crowded profession, trying to make a name in an industry that could be mercilessly selective. But he had something many actors spend their lives trying to manufacture. He had impact. When he appeared, the frame seemed to understand him. His height, his eyes, his voice, his confidence, all of it worked together. There was nothing casual about the effect. He looked like a man around whom events might gather. And the British film industry eventually found a use for him. During the war years, the Gainsborough melodramas became a phenomenon. They offered audiences candlelit excess, moral danger, forbidden romance, and aristocratic decay. They were not subtle films, and they did not want to be. They were emotional, theatrical, glamorous, and intense. They gave people a way to feel everything larger than life. Stewart Granger fitted them perfectly. In films such as The Man in Grey and Fanny by Gaslight, he became one of the faces of a particular wartime fantasy. He could play charm with a threat underneath it. He could stand in a room full of refinement and make the refinement feel unsafe. He could look like both temptation and punishment. That combination made him thrilling. He was not merely handsome. He was handsome in a way that suggested consequences. Audiences noticed, British cinema noticed, women noticed. And Granger, never a man who seemed designed for small ambition, began to understand what he could become. Yet even then, there was a hidden tension in his image. He was admired for the very qualities that could make real intimacy difficult. Force, certainty, dominance, fire. On screen, those qualities became glamour. At home, they could become pressure. In a movie, a strong-willed man appears romantic because the story ends before the ordinary days begin. In life, ordinary days are where character is tested. A film can turn jealousy into drama. Marriage cannot survive on drama forever. A film can turn pride into nobility. A family must live with the wounds pride leaves behind. By the late 1940s, Granger had become one of Britain's most visible male stars. He had a wife, actress Elspeth March, and children. He had a career many actors would have considered secure. He had the respectability of success. But respectability was not enough for him. Some people want achievement, others want transformation. Granger seemed to want transformation. He wanted the next landscape, the next challenge, the next proof that life could still expand. And then he met Jean Simmons. In 1949, on the set of Adam and Eveline, Stewart Granger came face to face with a woman who would become one of the central emotional figures of his life. Jean Simmons was young, luminous, and already marked for greatness. She had appeared in major British films and carried a rare combination of beauty and intelligence. Her face had innocence but not emptiness. Her eyes seemed to understand more than the script required. Granger was older, he was married, he had responsibilities. But passion has never been famous for respecting structure. Their relationship became one of the great romantic storms of British cinema at the time. To the outside world, it had everything newspapers loved: beauty, age difference, scandal, glamour, and the collapse of an existing marriage. To Granger, it seems to have been more than scandal. It was fixation, it was intoxication, it was the feeling that life had suddenly become larger, brighter, more dangerous. And for a man already drawn to danger, that feeling must have been almost impossible to resist. His marriage to Elspeth March ended. In 1950, Stewart Granger married Jean Simmons. The pairing looked impossible to ignore. He was the dark, commanding, romantic hero. She was the young English beauty with a future opening before her. Together, they seemed like cinema had written them into real life. But real life is less obedient than cinema. Almost immediately, their marriage was pulled into the machinery of Hollywood power. Howard Hughes, who controlled RKO, had become interested in Jean Simmons as a star. Public accounts have long described the arrangement as difficult and oppressive, with Hughes exerting power over her contract and career. Granger, by temperament, was not a man who accepted domination from another man quietly, especially not where his wife was concerned. The conflict around Simmons, Hughes, RKO, and her career became part of the couple's early Hollywood story. It was a brutal introduction to American movie power. Hollywood could offer palaces, swimming pools, contracts, chauffeurs, and global fame. But it could also turn a young actress into property on paper. And it could teach even a proud man like Granger that anger did not always defeat money. Still, Hollywood wanted him. MGM understood what British audiences had already learned. Stewart Granger looked like adventure, so they gave him adventure. In 1950, King Solomon's Mines changed the scale of his life. Shot on location in Africa, the film was a massive production for its time. It placed Granger into landscapes that made studio sets feel suddenly small. Mountains, rivers, open sky, heat, dust, distance. It was exactly the kind of environment that made his screen persona feel real. Some actors shrink outside the controlled elegance of a soundstage. Granger expanded. He looked believable against wild country. He looked like a man who could endure discomfort without losing authority. Audiences responded. The film became one of the defining adventure movies of its era and turned Granger into an international star. And here the tragedy begins to hide inside the triumph. Because King Solomon's Mines did not merely make him famous, it fixed him in the public imagination as a man of action, a man of appetite, a man who belonged in motion. The camera loved him most when he was traveling toward danger. But a life cannot be lived forever as an expedition. There must eventually be a room, a chair, a family, a silence. And Stewart Granger was never as comfortable with silence as he was with movement. After King Solomon's Mines, the golden period came quickly. There was Scaramouche, with its elegance, colour, swordplay, and sweeping energy. There was The Prisoner of Zenda, a story of mistaken identity and royal intrigue. There was Young Bzess, where Granger appeared opposite Jean Simmons in a historical drama that allowed their real-life glamour to burn through the screen. These films belonged to a Hollywood that knew how to manufacture grandeur. Costumes were rich, music surged, faces were lit like icons, men fought for honor, women suffered beautifully, and every frame seemed to suggest that life, if one were lucky enough, could be lived at a higher pitch. Stewart Granger stood at the center of that illusion. He wore power well. He looked natural in palaces, on horseback, in uniform, under foreign suns. His body seemed to understand action before the director called for it. For a few years, he was exactly what the industry needed. A British star who could carry American spectacle. A romantic hero who could look both civilized and untamed. A man who gave audiences the fantasy of danger without the ugliness of real violence. The money came, the attention came, the invitations came, and with them came the quiet assumption that it would last. That is one of fame's most seductive lies. At the peak, permanence feels natural. The public knows your face. The studio returns your calls. The newspapers print your name. Strangers look at you as though your life must be perfect. And because everyone else believes the illusion, the star may begin to believe it too. For Granger, the Hollywood years were not merely professional success. They were a world of surfaces, movement, and controlled magnificence. There were studio lunches, publicity photographs, premieres, fittings, negotiations, and the strange daily ceremony of being treated as valuable property. A star under contract did not fully own himself. He belonged partly to the studio. His body, his image, his voice, his schedule, even his romances became part of a larger commercial machine. In photographs, he looked free. In reality, freedom was more complicated. The studio could build a man into a legend, but it could also decide what kind of legend he was allowed to be. Granger was placed inside a heroic mold because the mold worked. Audiences believed him in adventure. They believed him in costume. They believed him in motion. And Hollywood, once it finds a profitable shape, rarely hurries to change it. This brought him fame, but it also narrowed him. The world loved Stewart Granger as long as he remained the Stewart Granger it expected. The man himself was more restless than that. He had intelligence, wit, irritation, opinions, romantic hunger, anger, pride, and insecurity. He was not merely the polished image on a poster, but the poster was easier for the public to love. That is one of the loneliest things about stardom. The more famous the image becomes, the more invisible the person may feel behind it. And while the image prospered, the marriage to Jean Simmons was being tested by the same forces that had made them glamorous. They were two beautiful people in an industry that made beauty a public event. They were both ambitious. They were both watched. They were both working. And they were both trying to build private life under conditions almost designed to destroy privacy. Hollywood marriages often collapsed not because love was absent, but because there was too much heat around it, too many eyes, too many absences, too many egos, too much professional uncertainty disguised as luxury. A house could be beautiful and still feel unstable. A party could be glittering and still end with silence in the car. A couple could appear on screen together and still fail to understand each other at breakfast. Granger and Simmons looked like a dream, but dreams are fragile when exposed to daily life. By public and personal accounts, he could be difficult. He could be jealous. He could be demanding. He could say what he thought before considering the wound it might leave. Jean Simmons was not merely a beautiful wife standing beside a famous husband. She was an artist with her own intelligence, her own career, her own will. She had survived Hollywood pressure. She had talent that did not depend on his presence. And as the 1950s moved forward, the imbalance between their needs became harder to ignore. He wanted loyalty, admiration, perhaps control. She needed room. That is often how glamorous marriages begin to fail. Not in one dramatic scene, but in hundreds of private moments where two people discover that love has not made them safe for each other. There were films together. There were public appearances. There was still beauty. But beauty is not a shelter. Their daughter Tracy was born in 1956. Family life from the outside might have seemed complete, but the structure was fragile. By 1960, Stewart Granger and Jean Simmons were divorced. For audiences, it was the end of a glamorous pairing. For Granger, it seems to have become one of the central regrets of his life. He would later write and speak with unusual honesty about his failures, his temper, and his part in the breakdown of relationships. That honesty matters. It does not erase the pain. It does not repair the marriage. But it complicates the portrait. Stewart Granger was not simply a man ruined by Hollywood. He was also a man who helped ruin what he loved. And that is a harder tragedy, because it offers fewer villains. After the divorce, the years became less golden. The roles did not vanish all at once. Decline rarely arrives that cleanly. At first, the phone still rings. The names are still respectable. The suits still look expensive. People still remember who you are. But something has shifted. The projects are not quite as grand. The scripts are thinner. The directors are less powerful. The posters are smaller. The attention feels borrowed. Granger continued to work. He made films in Europe. He appeared in westerns, adventure pictures, and television. He did what many aging stars do when the center of the industry moves away from them. He followed the work: Germany, Italy, Spain, America. Sets that were far from the MGM dream factory. Productions that offered employment but not myth. He remained professional. He remained watchable. The old authority did not disappear. But the context had changed. A king in exile may still be a king in posture, but exile changes the air around him. For a man like Granger, whose identity had been built on scale, reduction must have felt especially cruel. He had been formed by large images, jungles, palaces, dueling halls, deserts, royal courts. Now the world was asking him to accept smaller rooms. And smaller rooms can echo more loudly than grand ones. There was another change happening around him, one that no individual actor could control. The studio system was dying. The kind of machinery that had made him a star was breaking apart. The old contracts, the publicity departments, the carefully managed personas, the huge backlot worlds, the belief that audiences would return again and again for the same kind of glamour, all of it was losing power. Television had invaded the living room. Younger audiences wanted something more modern, more rebellious, more psychologically raw. The beautiful certainty of Stewart Granger's screen world began to look antique. Marlon Brando did not look like Stewart Granger. James Dean did not move like Stewart Granger. The future did not wear a velvet doublet or fight a 7-minute sword duel. The future mumbled, rebelled, sweated, broke down, and questioned itself. Granger's screen image, once so powerful, began to belong to yesterday faster than anyone expected. And this is one of the harshest fates for a star. It is not that he loses talent. It is not that he suddenly becomes unwatchable. It is that the culture moves the spotlight a few feet away, and the star finds himself standing just outside its warmth. He is still there, but the world is no longer looking in quite the same direction. His personal life did not provide the stillness his career no longer gave him. He remarried. He tried again. He moved again. But trying again is not the same as changing. The pattern remained: intensity, motion, charm, conflict, departure. Some men spend their lives searching for the right woman. Others are really searching for the right version of themselves. Granger may have been doing both. He had children from his marriages. He cared about family, but the life of an international actor, combined with his temperament, made constancy difficult. Distance became part of the story. And distance, when repeated over years, becomes more than geography. It becomes a language. It teaches children how not to expect too much. It teaches fathers how to live with guilt. There is a particular kind of regret that belongs to restless men. It is not always immediate. In youth, movement feels like courage. Leaving one place for another feels like freedom. A new country, a new film, a new woman, a new house, a new beginning. Each one seems to promise that the old failures can be outrun. But time eventually reveals the pattern. The scenery changed. The man often did not. And when the man looks back, he may find that the things he thought he was escaping were traveling with him the whole time. By the 1970s, Stewart Granger was no longer the central figure he had once been. The entertainment world had changed almost beyond recognition. The young did not want their father's heroes. The old studios had lost their command. The adventure film had changed shape. Masculinity itself was being rewritten on screen. The proud, polished, romantic authority that had made Granger famous now seemed to belong to another age. He could see it. He was too intelligent not to see it, and too candid not to resent it. He was known for speaking plainly, sometimes too plainly. There is a kind of honesty that feels noble from a distance and exhausting up close. Granger had that kind. He disliked hypocrisy. He distrusted fools. He had opinions and did not decorate them for comfort. In youth, such frankness can look like confidence. In age, when power has faded, it can be mistaken for bitterness. Perhaps it was both. That is the sadness of his later public persona. He was often right about the cruelty of the business. Hollywood does discard people. It does worship youth. It does invite audiences to fall in love with faces, then punishes those faces for changing. It does transform living people into memories while they are still alive. Granger understood this with painful clarity. But understanding the machine does not make being abandoned by it hurt any less, and so he carried his memories like treasure and burden: the great films, the great women, the locations, the money, the quarrels, the lost chances, the rooms where he had once mattered. He was not, in the strictest sense, a vanished man. He continued to work. He appeared in television and in films. He remained recognizable to people who had grown up with his image. But recognition is not the same as relevance. A person can be recognized and still feel forgotten. A waiter may know the face, a journalist may remember the name, a fan may ask for an autograph. But the industry itself, the living current of power and possibility, may have moved on. For a former star, this half-visibility can be more painful than obscurity. Obscurity at least allows privacy. Half-visibility keeps reminding the person of what he used to be. The world says, "I remember you," but it does not say, "I need you." Then, in the early 1980s, he did something many stars avoid. He wrote about himself. His autobiography, Sparks Fly Upward, was not merely a polished monument to a career. It was a reckoning. The title itself suggested struggle, a spark rising, a life thrown briefly into brightness, then darkness returning around it. In Memoir, Granger could still command a stage, but this time the battlefield was memory. He wrote about his career, his marriages, his anger, his mistakes, and the film world he had known. Public descriptions of the book have often noted its candor. And candor, for Granger, was both weapon and confession. He did not always hide behind charm. He did not always pretend to have been innocent. That is part of what makes him interesting. A lesser man might have blamed every wound on bad luck, bad women, bad studios, bad timing. Granger could blame others, certainly, but he could also turn the blade inward. He knew he had been difficult. He knew he had failed people. He knew love had come to him, and that he had not always known how to keep it safe. There is a particular sadness in late honesty. It is valuable, it is brave, but it arrives after the doors have closed. A memoir can explain. It cannot give a child back the years, it cannot restore a marriage, it cannot make a studio young again. It cannot return a man to the moment before pride spoke too sharply. Still, it offered Granger something. For a while, people listened again. Journalists called, old fans remembered. A younger audience discovered that the man behind the old adventure films had a voice sharper, funnier, and more wounded than the posters suggested. But renewed attention is not the same as renewed belonging. The world had not come back. It had only looked over its shoulder. This is an important distinction in the life of any former icon. The past can be revived for an interview. It can be packaged in a retrospective. It can be applauded at a screening. But revival is temporary. After the event, the lights go down again. The audience goes home. The old star returns not to the MGM of memory, but to the ordinary room waiting after the applause. And ordinary rooms had never been where Stewart Granger seemed most at ease. As Granger aged, his life took on the quiet dislocation familiar to many former stars. He lived between places. Spain had been important to him, so had America. Britain remained part of his origin, but not necessarily his home in any simple sense. That is another hidden cost of international fame. It gives a person many addresses and sometimes no true place to rest. A star can belong everywhere in public and nowhere in private. Granger had crossed too many borders, both literal and emotional, to return easily to one fixed identity. Was he the English leading man, the MGN adventurer, the European working actor, the ex-husband of Jean Simmons, the difficult memoirist, the aging relic of a vanished Hollywood? He was all of them, and none of them could fully save him. In later years, the people who had populated his golden age began to disappear. Friends died, colleagues faded, the industry filled with new faces who had no personal memory of the old hierarchy. The studios remained as names, but not as kingdoms. The places were still there, yet the world that had given them meaning was gone. This is one of aging's quiet cruelties. You do not only lose people, you lose the version of the world that understood you. For Stewart Granger, that loss must have been especially sharp. He had been a man of presence. Presence requires witnesses. And the witnesses were vanishing. The young could watch Scaramouche and admire the swordplay. They could watch King Solomon's mines and enjoy the adventure. But they could not fully understand what it meant to see him when he was new. They could not feel the force of a cinema audience discovering him in real time. They could not know the exact temperature of that fame. Memory became his kingdom, but memory is a kingdom with no guards. Anyone can leave. There is something haunting about the old Hollywood men who survived into an era that no longer needed their kind of myth. They had been taught that charm could open doors, that masculine confidence could solve problems, that a well-cut suit, a deep voice, and a controlled expression could carry a man through almost anything. But the late 20th century was not kind to that illusion. The culture had become less obedient. Women had become less willing to be managed. Audiences had become less interested in polished certainty. The world had grown suspicious of the very qualities that had once made men like Granger desirable, and perhaps that was fair. Perhaps the old myths needed to be questioned. But for the men who had built their lives inside those myths, the questioning felt like erasure. Granger had been made by a world of bold outlines: hero, lover, husband, adventurer, star. Age blurred those outlines. It made him more human. And to become more human after being treated as myth can feel like a kind of fall. Health, too, began to impose its own limits. Granger was diagnosed with prostate cancer in his later years. Illness does something fame cannot negotiate with. It reduces life to the body, to appointments, to fatigue, to the need for help. The man who had been paid to appear indestructible now faced the ordinary vulnerability of age. No lighting could remove it. No costume could disguise it. No director could call cut. For someone whose image had been built on masculine force, illness must have carried a private humiliation. Not because illness is shameful, but because every public myth has an opposite truth. The opposite of the swashbuckler is not the coward. It is the patient, the man waiting in rooms, the man measuring strength by whether he can rise, walk, endure, sleep. The heroic body becomes a human body, and the human body asks for tenderness. Tenderness is not the same as admiration. Admiration can come from strangers. Tenderness must be earned and maintained, usually in the smallest ways over many years. This is where Granger's story becomes most quietly painful. He was not abandoned by everyone. He was not without friends, family, or memory, but he had lived in a way that made deep steadiness difficult. Movement had been his pattern. Intensity had been his signature. And near the end, what he needed was not intensity, it was continuity, the daily mercy of someone being there, not because he was famous, not because he had once worn a sword, not because his name still meant something to old movie lovers, but simply because he was a man reaching the end of his life. In this final stage, the great themes of his life returned in smaller, sharper forms. Love returned as memory, fame returned as nostalgia, adventure returned as stories, beauty returned as photographs. The past was intact only in fragments: a face on a poster, a scene on television, a line in an obituary prepared before death, a fan's memory of seeing him when both of them were young. But the present was quieter, and the quiet asked questions that success had once postponed. What remains when the applause is gone? What remains when beauty becomes memory? What remains when the people who knew your strongest self are no longer around to confirm it? What remains when a man who spent his life moving finally has nowhere urgent to go? For Stewart Granger, the answer was complicated. He had his films. He had his children, though the relationships carried the weight of distance and time. He had his memories. He had his honesty. He had the pride of knowing that, for a brief and brilliant period, he had truly mattered in cinema. But he also had regret. Not the theatrical regret of a man performing sadness for attention. A more private regret. The regret of recognizing that a life can be extraordinary and still emotionally unfinished. That is the deeper wound in his story. He did not fail in the ordinary sense. He was not a nobody. He was not a man who never reached the summit. He reached it. He stood there. He looked magnificent. And then he had to come down. Many people never experience the pain of decline because they never experience that height. But for those who do, the descent can feel endless. Every later year is measured against the peak. Every new room is compared to the old ones. Every young face in the industry is a reminder that the machine has chosen someone else. Every mirror becomes a private negotiation. Aging is difficult for almost everyone. For a professional beauty, it can feel like a public betrayal. For a heroic leading man, it can feel like the slow dismantling of his kingdom. Stewart Granger's kingdom had been made of light, and light by nature moves on. In August 1993, Stewart Granger died in California. He was 80 years old. The obituaries remembered him respectfully. They named the films. They recalled the handsome adventure hero. They mentioned Jean Simmons. They placed him back into the golden age, where he would always look strongest. That is what obituaries often do. They tidy a life. They arrange it into titles, dates, marriages, successes, and final illness. They make a human being legible. But Stewart Granger was not tidy. He was grand and flawed, loving and difficult, brave and vain, honest and wounding. A man who could fill a screen yet struggle to fill a home with peace. His legacy remains in those old films, where he is forever moving toward danger with perfect confidence. In King Solomon's Mines, he is still under the African sky. In Scaramouche, he is still young enough to make swordplay look like destiny. In The Prisoner of Zenda, he is still wrapped in the fantasy of honor, romance, and royal intrigue. The films do not age the way bodies do. They preserve the illusion. They keep the jaw firm, the eyes bright, the costume immaculate, the stride unbroken. Cinema is merciful like that. It remembers people at their most convincing. Life remembers everything else. And everything else is where the real Stewart Granger lived. Not only in the adventure, not only in the romance, not only in the anger, not only in the regret, but in the contradiction between them. He wanted life at full volume. He wanted love, but resisted the humility love requires. He wanted freedom, but freedom often cost him belonging. He wanted truth, but truth without tenderness can become another form of violence. He wanted to be larger than ordinary life, and for a while he was. But no one can remain larger than life forever. Eventually life demands to be met on its own terms. Quiet, honestly, without music, without applause, without a camera turning pain into victory. That is the final lesson in Stewart Granger's story. Fame can magnify a man, but it cannot complete him. Beauty can open doors, but it cannot teach patience. Adventure can make a life spectacular, but it cannot make it peaceful. And admiration, however intoxicating, is not the same as love. Stewart Granger gave audiences the fantasy of a fearless man. But his real story is more human than fearless. It is the story of someone who won the world's attention and still searched for a place to rest. A man who could ride through danger, cross continents, command a screen, and stand before millions as a symbol of strength. Yet in the end, what remained most haunting was not the sword, the horse, the costume, or the fame. It was the silence after all. The silence where a man finally sees what he gained, and what he lost. Stewart Granger was not merely a falling star. He was a reminder that some people can have adventure instead of peace, applause instead of closeness, a legend instead of a home. And by the time they understand the difference, the lights have already begun to dim.